But Landmarkism basically says Baptists don't belong to any of this. Like they just like throw out the whole diagram, okay? So if you're Anabaptist, you learn how to write sideways. If your Anabaptist Descent comes out of the radicals and your English separatist view comes out of the Reformed tradition, the landmark view starts here and essentially says that going all the way back to the primitive church, and by primitive church, what we typically mean is Christians in the New Testament, okay? Going all the way back to the primitive church, there has been an unbroken but kind of informal line of Baptist churches that no one's just ever kind of connected all the dots until the 1880s and J.M. Carroll and a couple other guys. So they would basically say that Baptist churches have always existed because Baptist churches are the only real church. They're the only true church, okay? Now, a lot of issues to unpack there. But what they do, and you can actually look it up, you can Google tonight, J.M. Carroll, Trail of Blood, right? And that's not as scary as it sounds. It's not a horror movie. But it's a little booklet, it's a timeline that he writes, and he essentially tracks through church history Baptist churches, Baptist congregations throughout church history. Now, what Landmarkism does is, and this is, now, so I want to show my cards here. What Landmarkism does, this is a critique. What Landmarkism does is they essentially create an entirely new Christian historiography. They create an entirely new Christian history where essentially there was no widespread, well, essentially the true church, right? The true church went into exile after Constantine, right? So go all the way back to like 325. The true church kind of goes underground, goes into exile. And the true church kind of secretly, kind of underground, continuing to practice believers' baptism, exists, but in kind of an underground, informal way, all the way from kind of the 300s until, more modern expressions of Baptists. And so what the landmarkers would say is modern Baptist churches, even from the 1700s forward, is just a renewed, reinvigorated Baptist community that stretches all the way back to the primitive church. Now, a lot of problems with that. One of the big problems is history. And so the big critique against Landmarkism, I would say, is that as you look at J.M. Carroll's Trail of Blood, what he calls Baptist churches carries you through a trail, but it's almost always kind of a trail of heretics, right? He connects the dots with groups throughout church history, many of which deny the Trinity, some of which deny the divinity of Christ or the humanity of Christ. It's kind of a church history kind of rogues gallery. But for landmarkers, all that matters is believers' baptism, right? Like you could, I'm exaggerating more than a little bit here, but you could sacrifice goats on Sunday morning, but as long as you baptize somebody through believers' baptism, you're good. You're a Baptist church, right? So it's kind of reducing what a Baptist church is to the act of believers' baptism. Now, Landmarkism was incredibly popular, particularly amongst Southern Baptists in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and still exists, still is fairly popular in some communities, particularly within Kentucky, Tennessee, East Texas for sure, and a few other spots here and there. So Landmarkism still kicks around. There's still some landmarker Baptist scholars kicking around, but this is a novel. I would call it a novel. By novel, I just mean more recent and a relatively minority opinion, right? But it exists, and so you should know about it, right? So, 3 views, right? Essentially what we're looking at, 3 different views on Baptist origins. Now, as Dr. Matz mentioned, having different views on Baptist origins doesn't necessarily mean that you land in a different spot, right? So, as you could probably tell, Dr. Matz is a proponent of a variation within the Anabaptist Descent view. I'm more keen on an English Separatist Descent. Why the differences? A lot of it just depends on kind of how you do history, what information you prioritize, right? So one of the things that I prioritize, and I've got the microphone, so I get to talk first, but one of the things that I prioritize is creeds and confessions, right? So how do you know, how can you trace kind of a family tree? Well, one of the ways you can trace a family tree is through their stories, right? Through what they say about themselves, where someone comes from, right? So one of I think the stronger arguments, so we talked about some strong arguments for Anabaptist Descent. One of the strong arguments I think for English Separatist Descent is the earliest Baptist confessions, starting all the way with Thomas Helwys, right? Thomas Helwys, who you can kind of think of him as almost like the associate pastor there at that first church in Amsterdam. That church eventually, Smythe leaves that church and becomes a Mennonite. He joins that kind of Mennonite congregation in the Waterlanders. They never actually accept him until right at the very end. They kind of give him kind of a halfway covenant sort of thing. But by 1611, that church moves back to England. And that's where we're going to kind of pick up the story next week is that first English Baptist congregation. But Smythe stays in Amsterdam with some of the members of that church. But Helwys, he picks up and takes, again, church split, shocker, right? Helwys takes some of the families within that church, moves back to England to a town called Spacialfield. It's a suburb of London. Well, it was then. Today it's like right in the middle of London. But they move back to Spacialfield, and Helwys writes the first Baptist confession in English. And the occasion for the writing of this confession, this creed, kind of like we have the Baptist Faith and Message, Helwys writes the first Baptist confession in English. And the occasion for that writing, the reason he wrote it, is basically to say, we're not with Smith. We're not with Smythe, who had become an Anabaptist. We're not with those guys. Similarly, with the first London Baptist Confession, which is the first kind of multi-church, multi-Baptist church confession. We're going to talk about it more in detail next week. But when you get to the first London Baptist Confession, 1644, okay? It's actually written here. The opening line is written here on my coffee mug. It's written by a guy named William Kiffin, who this is his picture with awesome sunshade glasses on here. But the opening line, or part of the opening line from the first London Baptist Confession. So this is the first Baptist confession by more than one church. A bunch of churches got together and they said, okay, well, what do we believe? Well, these are the things that we believe. In the preamble, in the opening line of that confession, it says, commonly, though falsely, called Anabaptists, right? And so one of the strengths, I think, of this English separatist view is that the earliest Baptists did everything that they could to distance themselves from the Anabaptists. So, anyway, but that's just one particular strength. I think there are others, but we'll talk about them next week. So next week, we're going to talk about English Baptists, right? So regardless of your view of where Baptists ultimately originate, what's not really argued is that the kind of modern Baptists, right, find their origin in England, right? And so we're going to talk about those early English Baptists next week. So I'm going to try to open us up. If it's 6:02, if you need to go, feel free to go ahead and go. but I do want to leave some time for questions. So anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments, mild rebukes? I'm sure you do, Dr. Matz. I'm sure you do. But we're trying to keep it basic. And by basic, I mean stuff I care about. But yeah, but that's not the same trajectory. Though that's not the same, like, just because they live in the same house, just because they're similar. But Helwas's first confession. This is what I'm telling you. Helwas's first confession in England, Baptist confession in English, is saying we're not Anabaptist. The same thing with the first London Baptist confession. I know. All right, so other than that argument, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Very minor point, I'm sure. I noticed you use the term tradition and avoid the term denomination.
Very good observation. That's right. I do that purposefully. So I make a distinction between tradition and denomination. So a denomination, the way a lot of times we use them interchangeably, So we talk about the Baptist denomination. Technically, that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as the Baptist denomination. There are Baptist denominations, plural, right? But a denomination is an actual organized body, right? So it has rules and membership roles and constitution and bylaws and those sorts of things. Does that make sense? So in the Baptist tradition, eventually, so one of the things that happens very early in the Baptist tradition, we'll talk about this more next week, is almost right out of the gate, Baptists come together as associations, right? The local association. We're part of the local association right here. Baptists have been doing that. They've been associating locally for greater mission since the very beginning. Like within the first 15 years of the Baptist story, assuming it begins in the early 1600s. The very beginnings of the Baptist story, Baptist churches are associating together for missions, for evangelism, for a variety of things. So those groups, they're the ones writing like the first London Baptist Confession, right? They're writing confessional statements. They have membership roles, those sorts of things. So organized, ordered bodies like the Southern Baptist Convention, the Northern Baptist, the American Baptist, these sorts of things. So when I talk about denominations, I'm usually referring to specific organized bodies, whereas a tradition is more broad. It's a theological tradition, right? So for instance, even like Methodism, right? Like we usually think Methodist, the UMC church, right? The United Methodist Church. Well, Methodism is technically, that's the tradition, and then there are denominations within that. So even like just last year, the United Methodist Church is no longer united, right? It broke almost like 80-20, right? So, at least globally. Like most of the American Methodist churches stayed and becoming more significant. They were already a liberal denomination, but becoming even more liberal, kind of like the Episcopalians. But globally, you've got Methodists in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America, and that are significantly more theologically conservative. And they broke off and kind of formed their own communion, kind of formed their own denomination. But they're part of the same tradition. So yeah, that's a very good observation. That's why I make that distinction, kind of the difference between a kind of a theological river, if you will, and an organized body or an organized group. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Anything I was unclear about? Probably a lot, but hopefully this is one of those things that things kind of, you see the threads kind of pulling together the further into the story that we go. But all right, so again, next week we're going to focus on British Baptists, the earliest Baptist confessions. We'll talk about the particular and general Baptists, the Orthodox Creed, the First and Second London Baptist Confessions, and then kind of, if we have time, we may get into how Baptists got to America, and then the following week we'll talk about American Baptists. So, all right, friends, thank you so much for your attention tonight. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you, guys.